Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like you were walking on eggshells every single day, afraid that one wrong word or glance might set off an explosion? If you're watching from somewhere that feels safe and secure, count your blessings, because not everyone has that luxury. Celeste Romano smoothed her navy dress for the third time as she followed Trevor into Marcello's, the upscale Italian restaurant he'd chosen for their dinner. At 24, she should have been excited about a nice evening out, but instead her stomach churned with the familiar cocktail of anxiety and dread that had become her constant companion over the past 18 months. The restaurant was elegant in that understated way that whispered money rather than shouting it. Soft lighting from crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths and gleaming silverware, while the gentle murmur of conversation and clinking glasses created an atmosphere of refined intimacy. The kind of place where people came to celebrate anniversaries and close business deals, where raised voices would be noticed and frowned upon. Trevor had been in a decent mood when he picked her up from the small apartment they shared, even complimenting her appearance without the usual backhanded criticism about her weight or makeup choices. Celeste had allowed herself a tiny spark of hope that maybe tonight would be different, that maybe they could have one evening without his anger simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for any excuse to boil over. They were seated at a table near the center of the dining room, close enough to other patrons that Celeste felt a measure of safety in the crowd. Trevor ordered wine without consulting her, as he always did, choosing an expensive bottle that she knew would put a strain on their already tight finances. She wanted to protest, to suggest they stick to water or maybe one glass each, but she'd learned that questioning his decisions in public only made things worse later when they were alone. The waiter, a young man with kind eyes and a professional smile, approached their table with menus and the wine Trevor had selected. "Good evening," he said warmly. "Have you had a chance to look over our specials tonight?" Trevor waved him away dismissively. "We'll need a few minutes," he said, his tone already carrying an edge that made Celeste's shoulders tense. "And make sure that wine is properly chilled. The last time I was here, the service was completely inadequate." Celeste offered the waiter an apologetic smile, embarrassed by Trevor's rudeness. The young man handled it with grace, nodding politely before moving on to another table. She wished she could apologize properly, explain that Trevor's behavior didn't represent her own values, but she'd learned that defending others only triggered his jealousy and accusations about her flirting with other men. As they reviewed their menus in silence, Celeste found herself stealing glances around the restaurant, watching other couples who seemed relaxed and happy in each other's company. There was an older couple at a corner table who kept reaching across to touch each other's hands, their faces soft with decades of shared affection. A younger pair near the window laughed quietly over shared appetizers, their conversation flowing with the easy comfort of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. When was the last time she and Trevor had laughed together? When was the last time he'd touched her gently, without possession or irritation driving the gesture? Celeste couldn't remember, and that realization sent a familiar ache through her chest. At a table slightly behind Trevor and to his left, she noticed a man dining alone. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair styled in a way that suggested both money and attention to detail. His suit was clearly expensive, tailored to fit his broad shoulders and lean frame perfectly. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself, that suggested confidence and authority. He seemed completely comfortable in his own company, occasionally glancing up from his phone to observe the restaurant around him with intelligent dark eyes. Those eyes briefly met hers across the room, and Celeste felt a strange flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with anxiety. There was something magnetic about his gaze, something that made her want to keep looking even as she forced herself to turn her attention back to her menu. It had been so long since she'd felt attracted to anyone, since she'd allowed herself to notice other men at all, that the sensation was both thrilling and terrifying. Trevor's voice cut through her wandering thoughts like a knife. "Are you going to order sometime tonight? Or are you planning to stare around the room all evening like some kind of tourist?" The venom in his tone made her flinch, and she quickly focused on the menu in front of her. "I was just deciding between the salmon and the chicken," she said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "Well, decide faster," Trevor snapped. "Some of us don't have all night to waste on your indecision." Heat flooded Celeste's cheeks as she realized other diners were beginning to notice their table. The couple to their right had stopped their conversation to glance over, concern evident in their expressions. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, and escape the humiliation of being spoken to like a child in front of strangers. When the waiter returned, Trevor ordered for both of them without asking what she wanted. "The salmon for her," he said curtly, "and the ribeye for me. Medium rare. And we'll start with the calamari." "But I wanted the chicken," Celeste said before she could stop herself. The words slipped out automatically, a small rebellion against his assumption that he could speak for her. Trevor's face darkened instantly, his jaw tightening in the way that always preceded an explosion. "What did you say?" "I said I wanted the chicken," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "The salmon is fine, but I really prefer the chicken marsala." The silence that followed felt dangerous, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before a lightning strike. Trevor's hands clenched on the table, his knuckles white with tension. The waiter stood frozen beside their table, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere, but uncertain how to proceed. "You'll eat what I ordered for you," Trevor said, his voice low and deadly. "And you'll keep your mouth shut about your preferences. You seem to have forgotten your place lately, thinking you can make decisions and voice opinions like you're in charge of something." Celeste felt tears sting her eyes, humiliation and fear warring in her chest. Around them, conversations had quieted as other diners picked up on the tension radiating from their table. She wanted to stand up and walk out, to reclaim some shred of dignity, but she knew that would only make things infinitely worse when they got home. The waiter cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps the lady could have the chicken instead?" he suggested gently. "It's no trouble to change the order." Trevor turned his fury on the young man with frightening intensity. "Did I ask for your opinion?" he snarled. "When I want input from the help, I'll ask for it. Until then, keep your suggestions to yourself and bring us what I ordered." The waiter backed away quickly, clearly shaken by Trevor's aggression. Other patrons were now openly staring at their table, some looking alarmed by Trevor's behavior. Celeste wished she could disappear entirely, mortified by the scene he was creating. Trevor leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only she could hear. "You want to embarrass me in public? You want to show everyone what a disrespectful little bitch you really are? Fine. We'll finish this meal, and then we're going home. And when we get there, you're done. Do you understand me? You're done." The words hit her like physical blows, and Celeste felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. She'd heard that tone before, had learned to recognize it as the warning that preceded his worst rages. Tonight was going to be bad. Tonight was going to be worse than the time he'd grabbed her wrists so hard they bruised, worse than when he'd shoved her into the wall and called her worthless for hours afterward. Fear flooded her system, making her hands tremble as she reached for her water glass. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading for months, the inevitable escalation that she'd been too afraid to acknowledge was coming. Trevor had been getting worse, his anger more violent, his threats more specific. And now, surrounded by witnesses in a public place, he'd just promised to hurt her when they got home. From somewhere behind Trevor, she heard a chair scrape against the floor, followed by the measured sound of footsteps approaching their table. Celeste looked up to see the man who'd been dining alone moving toward them with purpose, his dark eyes fixed on Trevor with an intensity that made her pulse quicken for entirely different reasons than fear. There was something about the way he moved, something predatory and controlled, that suggested this was not a man to be trifled with. His expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the lean muscle beneath, and there was an air of authority about him that seemed to fill the space around their table. He stopped beside Trevor's chair, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the immediate vicinity. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily in the sudden hush that had fallen over their section of the restaurant. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but edged with something dangerous. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some difficulty with your evening. Perhaps I could be of assistance." Trevor looked up at the stranger with irritation and confusion, clearly not understanding the threat that Celeste could see clearly in the man's dark eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Trevor demanded. "This is a private conversation." The stranger smiled, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. "My apologies for the interruption," he said smoothly. "I'm Dante Salvatore, and I was simply concerned about the young lady's well-being. She seems distressed." Celeste stared up at him, her heart racing as she tried to process what was happening. This stranger, this incredibly attractive and clearly dangerous man, was inserting himself into her nightmare for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Part of her wanted to warn him off, to protect him from Trevor's rage, but a larger part of her was desperately grateful that someone had finally noticed, that someone seemed willing to help. "Mind your own business," Trevor snarled, rising from his chair to face Dante. "My girlfriend and I are having a private discussion, and we don't need input from random strangers who can't mind their own affairs." Dante's smile widened slightly, but his eyes remained cold. "Of course," he said quietly. "I certainly wouldn't want to intrude on such a private discussion. It's just that your private discussion seems to be causing distress to everyone in the immediate area, and I find that somewhat troubling." The two men faced each other across the table, and Celeste realized with growing alarm that Trevor had no idea what kind of danger he'd just walked into. There was something about Dante Salvatore that spoke of power and violence held carefully in check, something that suggested crossing him would be a very serious mistake. As the tension between them escalated, Celeste found herself caught between terror and a strange, desperate hope. For the first time in 18 months, someone was standing up for her. Someone was refusing to let Trevor's abuse go unchallenged. She didn't know who Dante Salvatore was or why he'd chosen to intervene, but she was suddenly, desperately grateful that he had. Trevor puffed up his chest in that way men do when they feel their territory has been challenged, but Celeste could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes as he took in Dante's imposing presence. "You need to walk away right now," Trevor said, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby tables, "before you regret getting involved in something that's none of your concern." Dante's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them, something that made the hair on Celeste's arms stand up. She'd never seen anyone radiate such quiet menace while maintaining perfect politeness, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited to see what would happen next. "I appreciate the advice," Dante said calmly, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, "but I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, when a man threatens a woman in my presence, especially with violence, it becomes very much my concern." Trevor's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're way out of line here," he snarled. "Celeste is my girlfriend, and how I talk to her is between us. So why don't you take your knight in shining armor routine and shove it where the sun doesn't shine?" Several nearby diners gasped audibly at Trevor's crude language, and Celeste felt her cheeks burn with mortification. She wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear entirely from this nightmare that was spiraling further out of control with each passing moment. Other patrons were openly staring now, some reaching for their phones as if preparing to call for help. Dante studied Trevor with the sort of calm assessment that reminded Celeste of a predator sizing up prey. His dark eyes were completely cold now, and when he smiled, it was the most frightening expression she'd ever seen on a human face. "You know," Dante said conversationally, "I don't think you understand the situation you're in right now. You just threatened violence against a woman in front of a restaurant full of witnesses, and now you're being deliberately provocative to someone you don't know. That suggests either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity, and I'm leaning toward the latter." As if summoned by some invisible signal, two large men in expensive suits appeared at neighboring tables, their attention focused entirely on Dante and clearly waiting for instructions. They hadn't been there moments before, but now they flanked Trevor's position with the practiced ease of professionals. The other diners seemed to sense their presence too, conversations dying away as the atmosphere in the restaurant grew heavy with tension. Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this situation had just escalated far beyond anything she could have imagined. Whoever Dante Salvatore was, he traveled with security, which meant he was either very wealthy, very dangerous, or both. And he'd just positioned his people around Trevor like pieces on a chessboard. Trevor's bravado faltered as he registered the new arrivals, his head swiveling between the two men who had appeared with such silent efficiency. "What is this?" he demanded, but his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Who are these guys?" "Associates of mine," Dante replied smoothly. "They're here to ensure this conversation remains civilized. Now, I believe you owe the lady an apology for your behavior this evening, and then you're going to leave this restaurant quietly and without causing any further disturbance. Like hell I am, Trevor snapped, but Celeste could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. You can't just order me around like some kind of mob boss. This is America, not some third-world dictatorship. Dante's laugh was soft and genuinely amused, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than if he'd been angry. Oh, my friend, he said quietly. You have no idea what kind of world you've just stepped into. One of Dante's men moved slightly closer to Trevor's chair, and suddenly Trevor seemed to understand that this wasn't a situation he could bully or bluster his way out of. His face went pale as he looked around the restaurant, perhaps hoping for support or intervention from the staff. But the waiters had all retreated to a safe distance, and the manager was nowhere to be seen. Celeste watched this unfold with a mixture of fascination and terror. Part of her was thrilled to see Trevor finally faced with consequences for his behavior, to watch him experience the fear and powerlessness he'd been inflicting on her for months. But another part of her was genuinely frightened by the display of power she was witnessing, by the casual way Dante commanded respect and obedience from dangerous-looking men. You're making a mistake, Trevor said, but the fight had gone out of him completely. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of men who clearly operated in a world where his bluster and threats meant nothing. I haven't done anything illegal here. Threatening a woman with violence is illegal in every jurisdiction I know of, Dante replied mildly. Verbal assault, intimidation, creating a public disturbance. I'm sure we could find several charges that would stick if we really wanted to pursue the matter. He gestured slightly with one hand, and the two men flanking Trevor stepped forward in perfect synchronization. I think it would be best for everyone if you gathered your things and left now, Dante continued. My friends here will escort you to the door to make sure you don't get lost on the way out. Trevor's eyes darted between the men surrounding him, then to Celeste, and finally back to Dante. This isn't over, he said, his voice shaking with impotent rage. You think you can just waltz in here and steal another man's girlfriend? You have no idea who you're dealing with. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop several degrees as Dante's expression hardened. Actually, Dante said very quietly, I think you're the one who doesn't understand who he's dealing with. And if you ever come near this woman again, if you so much as drive past her building or send her a text message, you'll discover exactly how serious I am about protecting what's under my care. Trevor started to respond, but one of Dante's men placed a firm hand on his shoulder, effectively ending the conversation. Time to go, the man said politely but firmly. We don't want to make a scene. As they escorted Trevor toward the restaurant exit, he turned back to shout at Celeste. This isn't over, Celeste. You hear me? You can't just run off with the first psychopath who offers to protect you. I know where you live. I know where you work. The threats sent ice through Celeste's veins, but before she could react, Dante had moved to place himself between her and Trevor, his body language radiating lethal intent. The man escorting Trevor quickened his pace, clearly understanding that his boss's patience had reached its limit. Within moments, Trevor had been removed from the restaurant entirely, leaving behind only the shocked murmurs of other diners and the rapidly normalizing atmosphere as staff hurried to restore order. Dante's remaining associate melted back into the general population as if he'd never been there at all, leaving Celeste alone at the table with a man who'd just demonstrated he commanded significant power and wasn't afraid to use it. Dante turned back to her with an expression that was remarkably gentle considering what had just transpired. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he said quietly, sliding into Trevor's abandoned chair as if he belonged there. Are you hurt? Did he put his hands on you? Celeste stared at him, still processing everything that had just happened. No, she whispered, her voice hoarse with shock. He hasn't hit me yet, but tonight. Tonight I thought he might. Yet, Dante repeated, his dark eyes hardening again. So this has been building for a while. She nodded, suddenly finding it impossible to maintain eye contact with this stranger who'd just turned her world upside down. Months, she admitted. He's been getting worse, more angry, more controlling. But I didn't know how to leave, didn't know where to go. The waiter appeared hesitantly at their table, clearly shaken by the evening's events. Sir, he said nervously, the management would like to know if everything is under control now. Dante looked up at him with a reassuring smile that was completely different from the predatory expression he'd shown Trevor. Everything's fine, he said calmly. Please give my compliments to your chef and add whatever damages or inconvenience we've caused to my bill. Also, the lady will be having the chicken marsala she originally requested." As the waiter hurried away with obvious relief, Dante turned his attention back to Celeste. "Now," he said gently, "we need to talk about what happens next. Your boyfriend made some very specific threats before he left, and I don't think we should take them lightly." Celeste's hands shook as she reached for her water glass. "He has keys to our apartment," she said quietly, "and he knows my work schedule, where I go to the gym, which coffee shop I visit in the mornings. He knows everything about my routine. Which means you can't go home tonight," Dante said matter-of-factly. "Probably not for several nights, until we can be sure he's not waiting for you there." The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She had nowhere to go. Most of her friends had drifted away over the past year as Trevor had gradually isolated her from her support network. Her family lived 3 states away and wouldn't understand why she'd stayed with him as long as she had. She was effectively homeless, dependent on the kindness of a stranger who'd just demonstrated he was far more dangerous than anyone she'd ever met. "I don't have anywhere else to stay," she whispered, the admission painful in its completeness. He made sure of that. Made sure I didn't have options. Dante studied her face with an expression that seemed both calculating and surprisingly compassionate. "I have a penthouse downtown," he said finally. "Secure building, good security staff, multiple exits. You could stay there until we figure out a more permanent solution to your situation." Celeste's mind reeled. Accept protection from a man who clearly had connections to organized crime? Move in with someone she'd met an hour ago? Everything about it seemed insane. But the alternative was going home to face Trevor's promised retaliation, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that she might not survive whatever he had planned for her. "I don't even know you," she said weakly. Dante's smile was rueful. "No, you don't. But you know him, and you know what he's capable of. I'm offering you safety, nothing more. Separate bedroom, privacy, time to figure out your next move without looking over your shoulder every 5 minutes." The chicken marsala arrived, but Celeste barely noticed it. Her entire life had just changed in the space of an hour, and she was struggling to process the magnitude of what was happening. This morning she'd been trapped in an abusive relationship with no way out. Now she was being offered refuge by a man who commanded respect through fear and had the resources to make her problems disappear. It should have been terrifying, and part of it was. But a larger part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. For the first time since Trevor had started showing his true colors, someone with real power was on her side. Someone who'd looked at her situation and decided to help rather than look away. "Okay," she said quietly, the word feeling like stepping off the edge of a cliff. "I'll come with you, at least for tonight." The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, and stepping into it felt like entering another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the living space, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city lights spread out below like a glittering carpet. The furnishings were modern and expensive, all clean lines and rich textures that spoke of wealth beyond anything Celeste had ever experienced. She stood just inside the entrance, clutching her purse with both hands, feeling completely out of place in her simple navy dress among the Italian leather furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than she made in a year. The space was enormous, easily 4 times the size of the cramped apartment she shared with Trevor, with soaring ceilings and an open floor plan that made her feel small and exposed. "Make yourself comfortable," Dante said, his voice gentle as he hung up his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, wine, water?" "Water would be nice," Celeste replied, her voice sounding strange and echoing in the vast space. She watched as he moved to the kitchen, which was a masterpiece of polished granite and stainless steel that belonged in a magazine spread rather than someone's actual home. The refrigerator was massive, one of those built-in models that cost more than most people's cars, and when Dante opened it she caught a glimpse of shelves stocked with fresh produce, expensive wines, and gourmet foods that suggested someone who took cooking seriously. He pulled out a bottle of sparkling water and poured it into a crystal glass that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. "You have a beautiful home," she said as he handed her the glass, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her. and she found herself noticing details about him that she'd missed in the restaurant. The way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the subtle cologne that mixed expensive woods with something warmer and more personal. "Thank you," Dante replied, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I don't entertain much, so I'm afraid I'm out of practice with house guests. Your bedroom is down this hall, and you'll have your own bathroom with everything you should need." He led her through the penthouse, pointing out amenities with the casual air of someone who'd grown up surrounded by luxury. The guest bedroom was larger than her and Trevor's entire living room, decorated in soft blues and grays with a king-size bed that looked like something from a five-star hotel. French doors opened onto a private balcony with views of the harbor, and there was a sitting area with a comfortable reading chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun. "I took the liberty of having some clothes sent up," Dante said, gesturing to several shopping bags arranged on the bed. "I had to guess at sizes, but the store assured me they could exchange anything that doesn't fit." Celeste stared at the bags with their high-end boutique logos, feeling overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness and simultaneously uncomfortable with accepting such expensive gifts from someone she barely knew. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I could have just worn what I have for another day or two." Dante's expression softened. "You left everything behind tonight," he said gently. "The least I can do is make sure you're comfortable while you're here." The kindness in his voice made tears sting her eyes, and she turned away to hide her emotional response. When was the last time someone had anticipated her needs like this, had gone out of their way to make sure she felt cared for? Trevor had trained her to be grateful for basic courtesy, to see the absence of cruelty as a form of generosity. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't know how to repay you for all this." "You don't need to repay anything," Dante said firmly. "Just focus on taking care of yourself. There are fresh towels in the bathroom, and the kitchen is fully stocked if you get hungry. I'll be up for a while yet if you need anything." After he left her alone, Celeste explored the guest bedroom with growing amazement. The bathroom was a spa-like retreat with a soaking tub that could easily fit 2 people and a shower with multiple jets that promised luxury beyond her wildest dreams. The clothes he'd had delivered were beautiful and clearly expensive, elegant pieces in her size that showed remarkably good taste for someone who'd met her only hours ago. She changed into a soft cashmere sweater and designer jeans that fit perfectly, then ventured back into the main living area to find Dante standing at the windows with a phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low and controlled, but there was an edge to it that made her pause in the doorway to listen. "I don't care what he thinks he can do," Dante was saying, his tone carrying the same quiet menace she'd witnessed at the restaurant. "Trevor Hoffman is going to learn that threatening women under my protection is a very dangerous game to play. Yes, I want him watched. 24 hours a day until further notice." Celeste's blood ran cold as the reality of her situation crashed over her. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman offering shelter to someone in need. This was something far more complex and dangerous, involving surveillance and threats, and the kind of power that operated outside normal legal channels. "Make sure he understands the consequences of ignoring my warning," Dante continued, oblivious to her presence in the doorway. "If he comes anywhere near her building or workplace, if he so much as drives past her coffee shop, I want to know about it immediately. And Marco? Make it clear that any attempt to contact her directly will be met with appropriate response." He ended the call and turned around, stopping short when he saw her standing there. The expression on her face must have told him exactly how much she'd overheard, because his jaw tightened slightly before he set his phone down on the marble coffee table. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Celeste replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough to know that you're not just some concerned citizen who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Dante studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh his options carefully. "No," he said finally. "I'm not." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Celeste wasn't sure she was ready to face. She'd suspected there was more to his story, had recognized the signs of someone accustomed to command and violence, but hearing him arrange surveillance and threaten retaliation made everything suddenly, starkly real. "What exactly are you?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm someone who takes care of problems that the regular authorities can't or won't handle," Dante said carefully. My family has been in that business for several generations, and we take our responsibilities very seriously. Family business. The euphemism sent chills down her spine as she processed what he was really telling her. She was standing in the penthouse of someone connected to organized crime. Someone whose idea of protection involved threats and surveillance, and men who appeared out of nowhere to handle problems with efficient violence. "You're talking about the Mafia," she said, the words falling between them like stones. Dante's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift in his dark eyes. "That's a very loaded term," he replied. "What I'm talking about is a code of honor that says when you see someone being hurt by a predator, you don't walk away. You stop the threat, and you protect the innocent." "But you're a criminal," Celeste said, even as part of her recognized the hypocrisy of her moral outrage. She was standing in his home, wearing clothes he'd bought her, accepting protection from the same power she was now condemning. "According to whose definition?" Dante asked mildly. "I've never hurt an innocent person in my life. I've never taken from anyone who couldn't afford to lose what I took. Everything I do is guided by a code that's probably stricter than the one followed by most so-called legitimate businessmen." He moved closer, not in a threatening way, but with the fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his movements. "The law isn't always right, Celeste," he said quietly. "Sometimes justice has to come from other sources." She wanted to argue with him, wanted to maintain the moral high ground that said accepting help from criminals was wrong regardless of circumstances. But the truth was that the legitimate authorities had never helped her with Trevor. The police had told her to call back when he actually hit her, had treated her fears as hysteria rather than valid concerns about escalating abuse. "I should leave," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Where would you go?" Dante asked, not unkindly. "Back to him. To a women's shelter where he can find you in a day because he knows your real name and social security number? To a hotel you can't afford for more than a night or two?" The questions hit their target with devastating accuracy because she had no good answers to any of them. Trevor knew too much about her life, had too many ways to track her down through official channels. The resources she needed to disappear completely were far beyond her means, and the legal system moved too slowly to protect someone whose abuser hadn't yet committed a prosecutable crime. "You're safe here," Dante said gently. "Safer than you've been in months, probably. Whatever moral reservations you have about my profession, I think you know I'm not going to hurt you." As if summoned by their conversation, Dante's phone began ringing with an aggressive tone that made them both tense. He glanced at the display, and his expression darkened immediately. "It's him," he said grimly. "Your ex-boyfriend apparently decided to test my resolve sooner than I expected." He answered the call with a curt greeting, then listened for a moment before his jaw tightened dangerously. "Put him on," he said finally. Trevor's voice was loud enough for Celeste to hear even from across the room, his words slurred with alcohol and rage. "You think you can just take my girlfriend, and there won't be consequences? You have no idea who you're dealing with, asshole. Celeste belongs to me, and I'm going to get her back whether you like it or not." Celeste felt her knees go weak as the familiar venom in Trevor's voice transported her back to every horrible fight they'd ever had, every threat he'd made when his anger got the better of his self-control. But this time was different because she wasn't alone with him, wasn't helpless and isolated with no one to witness his abuse. "Actually," Dante said with deadly calm, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation you're in. The woman you're referring to has made her choice to leave you, and that choice is going to be respected. If you continue to harass her or attempt to contact her in any way, you'll discover exactly how serious I am about protecting what's under my care." Trevor's response was a stream of profanity and threats that made Celeste flinch, but Dante listened to it all with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with unstable individuals. When Trevor finally ran out of steam, Dante spoke again with the same controlled politeness he might use to discuss the weather. "I'm going to assume that alcohol is talking right now," he said mildly, "because if I thought you were genuinely threatening violence against someone under my protection while sober, this conversation would end very differently. You have until tomorrow morning to sober up, and remember why staying away from Celeste is in your best interest." He ended the call without waiting for Trevor's response, then turned to find Celeste staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "He's not going to stop," she whispered. "He doesn't know how to let go of anything he considers his property, and that's how he sees me." Dante's expression was grim but determined. Then he's going to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between owning something and protecting it, he said quietly. One way or another, this ends now. A week had passed since that first terrifying night at the restaurant, and Celeste found herself settling into a routine that felt surreal in its unexpected comfort. Dante left early each morning for whatever business required his attention, always ensuring she had everything she needed and never pressuring her to explain her plans for the day. He returned in the evenings with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to long hours and complex responsibilities, but he always made time to check on her welfare with genuine concern. She'd spent her days exploring the neighborhood around his building, discovering coffee shops and bookstores within walking distance, gradually rebuilding a sense of independence she'd lost during her months with Trevor. The security staff in Dante's building treated her with respectful courtesy, clearly having been instructed to ensure her safety without making her feel imprisoned. It was the first time in over a year that she'd felt truly free to come and go as she pleased. This particular evening found them sharing dinner in his kitchen, a surprisingly domestic scene that felt both natural and charged with unspoken tension. Dante had cooked again, demonstrating skills that spoke of someone who'd learned to care for himself at an early age. The pasta was perfect, the wine carefully chosen to complement the meal, and the conversation had flowed easily between topics that carefully avoided the more dangerous aspects of their situation. "You don't have to cook for me every night," Celeste said as she helped clear the dishes, acutely aware of how close they stood at the kitchen sink. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "I know you are," Dante replied, his voice warm with something that made her pulse quicken. "But I like cooking for you. It's been a long time since I've had someone to cook for." There was something in his tone that suggested layers of loneliness beneath his self-sufficient exterior, and Celeste found herself studying his profile as he rinsed their wine glasses with careful attention. In the soft lighting of the kitchen, with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, he looked younger somehow, less intimidating than the man who'd commanded such authority at the restaurant. "Tell me about your family," she said impulsively, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his hand still on the glass he was holding. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. I know it's not really any of my business." Dante was quiet for so long that she thought he might ignore the question entirely. Then he set down the glass and turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting emotions she couldn't quite read. "My parents were killed when I was 12, he said simply. "Car bomb meant for my uncle, but they were borrowing his car that weekend for their anniversary dinner." Celeste's heart clenched with sympathy and horror. "Oh God, Dante, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." He shrugged with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to carry grief without letting it show. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly. "My uncle Giuseppe raised me after that, brought me into the family business. He used to say that my parents' death taught me early that life is fragile and the people you care about need protection." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Celeste could hear it nonetheless. She understood now why he'd intervened that night at the restaurant, why the sight of Trevor threatening her had triggered such a powerful protective response. He'd learned too young that violence could destroy everything precious in an instant. "Is that why you do what you do?" she asked gently. "Because you couldn't protect them?" Dante's smile was sad and knowing. "Maybe," he admitted. "Giuseppe always said I had too much of my father's protective instinct and my mother's sense of justice. It makes for a dangerous combination in our world." They stood close together in the kitchen, the dinner dishes forgotten as the conversation shifted into more intimate territory. Celeste could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of garlic and wine from their meal, could see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who'd seen too much too young. There was something about his vulnerability and sharing his past that made her feel brave enough to offer her own painful truths. "I understand about dangerous combinations," she said quietly. "My father was controlling too, in his own way. Never violent like Trevor, but he made all the decisions for our family and expected complete obedience. I think that's why I stayed with Trevor so long, why I didn't recognize the warning signs until it was almost too late." Dante's attention focused on her with laser intensity, his dark eyes studying her face as if he could read the history of her pain in her expressions. "Tell me about it," he said gently. Celeste leaned against the kitchen counter, needing the support as she delved into memories she usually tried to avoid. My mother never disagreed with him about anything, never questioned his decisions, even when they were obviously wrong. She taught me that keeping peace was more important than standing up for myself, that a good woman supports her man even when he's being unreasonable. The words felt strange in her mouth, admissions she'd never made to anyone, including herself. But there was something about Dante's quiet attention that made her feel safe to explore these difficult truths, to examine the patterns that had led her into Trevor's trap. When Trevor started getting possessive, when he began making decisions for me and getting angry when I had my own opinions, it felt familiar, she continued. Normal, even. It took me months to realize that what felt familiar wasn't actually healthy. Dante moved closer without seeming to think about it, his presence warm and solid beside her. You were conditioned to accept that treatment, he said quietly. That's not your fault, Celeste. That's not a weakness in you. The gentleness in his voice made tears sting her eyes, and she found herself looking up at him with gratitude and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. When was the last time someone had looked at her past with understanding rather than judgment? When had anyone ever suggested that her mistakes weren't character flaws, but learned responses to unhealthy patterns? You make me feel like I'm not broken, she whispered, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. You're not broken, Dante said firmly, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with surprising tenderness. You're strong enough to recognize the problem and brave enough to walk away from it. That takes more courage than most people have. The touch of his hand against her face sent warmth flooding through her entire body, and Celeste found herself leaning into the contact despite every rational thought that told her this was dangerous territory. There was something magnetic about his proximity, something that made her want to close the distance between them and discover what it would feel like to be touched by someone who saw her as precious rather than property. Celeste, Dante said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion that made her pulse race. Yes, she breathed, looking up into his dark eyes and seeing her own desire reflected there. He leaned closer, his free hand settling on her waist with careful reverence, and Celeste felt her breathing quicken as the space between them dwindled to almost nothing. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the intoxicating combination of his cologne and something uniquely him. The shrill sound of his phone cut through the moment like a blade, making them both freeze as reality crashed back into their intimate bubble. Dante's expression hardened as he recognized the ringtone, and he stepped back from her with obvious reluctance. I have to take this, he said grimly, his hand still lingering on her waist for a moment before he forced himself to move away. It's Marco, my security chief. Celeste watched him answer the call, trying to calm her racing heart as she processed how close they'd come to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The attraction between them was undeniable, had been building with each day of domestic intimacy and shared conversation, but acting on it would complicate an already complex situation in ways she wasn't sure she was prepared for. What do you mean he's been watching the building? Dante's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp with controlled anger. How long has this been going on without me knowing about it? Ice flooded Celeste's veins as the implication of his words sank in. Trevor had found her. Despite all of Dante's security measures and warnings, Trevor had somehow discovered where she was staying and had been conducting surveillance like some kind of stalker. Dante listened to whatever information Marco was providing, his face growing darker with each passing moment. Double the security on all entrances, he ordered curtly. I want to know everyone who comes within 2 blocks of this building, and I want constant surveillance on Hoffman until further notice. He ended the call and turned back to her with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and grimly determined. Trevor's been conducting surveillance on this building for at least 3 days, he said quietly. My people spotted him parked across the street this afternoon with binoculars and a camera. Celeste felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. He knows I'm here, she whispered. He's been watching me come and go, probably taking pictures, building some kind of plan. Dante moved back to her immediately, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle strength. Hey, look at me, he said firmly. You're safe here. He can watch all he wants, but he can't get to you. This building has security that would challenge a federal facility. But for how long? Celeste asked, hating how small her voice sounded. He's not going to give up, Dante. He'll find a way to get to me eventually. or he'll hurt someone else to force me to come to him. Not on my watch, Dante replied with quiet intensity. I've dealt with men like Trevor before, and they all have the same weakness. They underestimate what they're up against when they threaten something I care about. The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Celeste's heart skip. Something he cared about. When had she become that to him? When had this arrangement shifted from simple protection to personal investment? Before she could examine that thought too closely, there was a knock at the penthouse door that made them both tense. Dante checked his phone and relaxed slightly. That's Marco, he said. I asked him to come up and brief us on the security situation. The man who entered was younger than Celeste had expected, probably in his late 20s, with the same careful alertness she was beginning to recognize in all of Dante's associates. He was handsome in a rough-edged way, with sandy hair and intelligent green eyes that assessed her quickly before focusing on his boss. Marco Benedetti, Dante said by way of introduction. My cousin and head of security. Marco, this is Celeste. Marco nodded respectfully to her before turning to Dante with the easy familiarity of family. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Hoffman isn't working alone anymore. We spotted him meeting with 2 other men this afternoon, and from their body language, it looked like he was hiring muscle. Dante's jaw tightened dangerously. Local talent or imports? Local, as far as we can tell, Marco replied. Small-time operators who probably don't understand what they're getting involved in. But they're motivated by whatever Hoffman is paying them, and that makes them unpredictable. Celeste listened to this exchange with growing alarm, realizing that her presence in Dante's life had escalated from a simple rescue operation to something that might require violence to resolve. The guilt was overwhelming. The knowledge that her inability to handle her own problems had drawn innocent people into danger. This is my fault, she said quietly, drawing both men's attention. I should have found another way to deal with Trevor, should have gone to the police or left town instead of dragging you into this. Dante's response was immediate and firm. This is not your fault, he said, moving to stand beside her with protective intent. You didn't create this situation, and you're not responsible for his escalation. Men like Trevor create their own problems through their inability to accept consequences. Marco studied the dynamic between them with knowing eyes, and Celeste saw understanding dawn in his expression. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This had become personal for Dante in a way that went far beyond his usual professional obligations. What do you need from me? Marco asked his cousin, and Celeste heard the family loyalty in his voice, the willingness to follow whatever course Dante decided was necessary. I need options, Dante replied grimly, and I need them before Hoffman and his new friends decide to test our defenses. As the 2 men began discussing security protocols and response strategies, Celeste found herself studying Dante's profile and trying to understand the complex emotions churning in her chest. Fear for her safety, certainly, and guilt about the danger her presence had brought to his world. But underneath those rational concerns was something warmer and more troubling, gratitude that was rapidly evolving into deeper feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to name. When Marco left an hour later, armed with new instructions and a grim expression, Celeste found herself alone with Dante again in a penthouse that suddenly felt less like a safe haven and more like a fortress under siege. I'm sorry, she said quietly as he poured them both glasses of wine with hands that were perfectly steady despite the evening's revelations. I never meant for this to become so complicated. Dante handed her a glass and settled beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Complicated doesn't begin to describe it, he agreed, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. But I wouldn't change anything about how we got here. The admission was quiet but loaded with meaning, and Celeste felt something shift in the air between them as they acknowledged the truth that had been building for days. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This had become something deeper, something that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. Dante, she said softly, setting down her wine glass and turning to face him fully. I know, he replied, his hand coming up to trace the line of her cheek with reverent gentleness. I know this is complicated and dangerous and probably insane, but I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore. Neither can I, Celeste whispered, leaning into his touch and feeling the last of her resistance crumble. This time when he leaned forward to kiss her, There were no interruptions, no urgent phone calls to shatter the moment. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, moving with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes even as desire flooded through her body. This was what she'd been missing all those months with Trevor, this sense of being cherished rather than claimed, wanted rather than possessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Dante rested his forehead against hers with an expression of wonder and determination. Whatever happens with Trevor, whatever complications this creates, I want you to know that you're not alone anymore, he said quietly. You have me, and you have my family's protection for as long as you want it. Celeste felt tears slip down her cheeks as the enormity of his promise washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe, truly valued, truly protected by someone strong enough to stand between her and the darkness that had been consuming her life. I want it, she whispered against his lips. I want you. 2 weeks had passed since that first kiss in Dante's kitchen, and Celeste found herself experiencing something she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine happiness. The days had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural and right, filled with quiet moments of connection and growing intimacy that made her previous life seem like a nightmare she'd finally awakened from. Dante had been patient and tender, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but the attraction between them had deepened into something that felt solid and real. They'd shared meals and conversations that stretched late into the night, discovered common interests and complementary differences that suggested a foundation strong enough to build something lasting on. For the first time in over a year, Celeste felt like herself again. The anxious, walking in eggshells woman who'd lived in constant fear of Trevor's moods had been replaced by someone who laughed easily, expressed opinions freely, and went to sleep each night feeling safe and valued. It was everything she dreamed of during those dark months when she'd thought she might never escape. She was making coffee in Dante's kitchen, humming softly to herself as morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Something cold settled in her stomach as she stared at the display, her instincts warning her that this call would shatter the peaceful bubble they'd built around themselves. Hello? She answered cautiously. Celeste, thank God, came her sister's voice, high and frightened in a way that made Celeste's blood freeze. It's Sophia. I'm in trouble. Sophia was 5 years younger than Celeste, still in her senior year of college, and the most important person in Celeste's world. She'd been the one bright spot during Celeste's relationship with Trevor, the one person whose presence could make him behave with something approaching civility, because he understood that hurting Sophia would be an unforgivable line to cross. What's wrong? Where are you? Celeste demanded, her free hand gripping the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles went white. There was a sound of struggle. Then Trevor's voice came on the line, smooth and satisfied in a way that made Celeste's stomach lurch with terror. Hello, baby, he said conversationally. I think you and I need to have a conversation. Trevor, if you hurt her, I swear to God, Celeste started, but he cut her off with a laugh that held no humor at all. You're not in a position to make threats, he said calmly. Your little sister is safe for now, but that could change very quickly depending on how cooperative you decide to be. I think it's time you came home where you belong. The phone slipped in Celeste's trembling hand as the full horror of the situation crashed over her. Trevor had taken Sophia. Her innocent baby sister was being held hostage because of Celeste's choices, because she dared to leave him and accept protection from someone he saw as a rival. What do you want? She whispered. I want what's mine, Trevor replied, his voice carrying the same possessive edge that had terrified her for months. I want you to stop playing house with your Mafia boyfriend and remember who you really belong to. You have 2 hours to come to the warehouse at 1247 Industrial Boulevard, and you come alone. If I see any of your new friends muscle, if I even suspect you've told him where you're going, your sister pays the price for your disloyalty. Trevor, please, she begged, hating how small and desperate she sounded. Sophia doesn't have anything to do with this. She's just a kid trying to finish college. Let her go, and I'll do whatever you want. 2 hours, Celeste, Trevor repeated. And remember, I know you well enough to spot any tricks you might try. Don't test me on this. The line went dead, leaving Celeste staring at her phone in shock and terror. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the kitchen floor, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what Trevor was demanding. He wanted her to walk into what was obviously a trap, to give up the safety Dante had provided and return to the nightmare she'd escaped, or watch her innocent sister suffer for her choices. Celeste? Dante's voice came from behind her, sharp with immediate concern. What happened? What's wrong? She turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work in one of his impeccable suits, but his attention was entirely focused on her with laser intensity. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know about the severity of the situation. Trevor has Sophia, she said, the words coming out in a broken whisper. He wants me to come to him alone, or he'll hurt her. Oh God, Dante, my sister is in danger because of me. Dante moved to her immediately, dropping to his knees beside her and gathering her into his arms with gentle strength. Tell me everything, he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm she'd learned to recognize as his most dangerous mood. Every word he said, exactly where he wants you to meet him. Through her tears, Celeste relayed Trevor's demands and threats, watching as Dante's expression grew progressively darker with each detail. By the time she finished, there was something lethal in his dark eyes that would have terrified her if it had been directed at her instead of at the man who'd dared to threaten someone under his protection. He's made a fatal mistake, Dante said quietly, his arms tightening around her protectively. Taking your sister escalates this beyond anything I'm willing to tolerate. He thinks he's cornered you, but what he's actually done is sign his own death warrant. Celeste pulled back to look at him, seeing the cold fury in his expression and understanding that Trevor had finally pushed too far. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about family, about honor, about lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. I have to go to him, she said desperately. I can't let him hurt Sophia because of my choices. I can't live with that. You're not going anywhere near him, Dante replied firmly. But we're going to get your sister back, and we're going to end this once and for all. Within 30 minutes, Dante's penthouse had been transformed into a command center. Marco arrived with two other men Celeste didn't recognize, their faces grim and professional as they laid out building schematics and surveillance equipment on Dante's dining room table. The efficiency with which they worked spoke of experience with exactly this type of operation. The warehouse is isolated, perfect for what he thinks he's planning, Marco reported, pointing to aerial photographs of the industrial district. But isolation works both ways. No witnesses, no civilian casualties to worry about. How many men does he have with him? Dante asked, studying the images with tactical precision. At least four that we've confirmed, including the two locals he hired earlier this week, Marco replied. Could be more inside the building. They're armed, but not professional, more street muscle than real security. Celeste listened to this exchange with growing agitation, hating that she was sitting on the sidelines while other people planned to risk their lives to save her sister. The guilt was overwhelming, but underneath it was a burning anger that Trevor had dragged innocent people into his twisted need for control and revenge. I'm going with you, she said suddenly, drawing startled looks from all the men in the room. Absolutely not, Dante replied immediately. You're staying here where it's safe. She's my sister, Celeste said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I'm not sitting here wondering whether she's alive or dead while you handle this without me. I need to be there. Dante's expression softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. Celeste, I understand how you feel, but walking into that warehouse puts you exactly where Trevor wants you. That makes everyone else more vulnerable, because we'll be worried about protecting you instead of focusing on the rescue. I'm not asking to carry a gun or participate in the fighting, Celeste said, meeting his gaze with determination she didn't know she possessed. But I need to be there when Sophia sees that she's safe. She's terrified and probably thinks I abandoned her. I need her to see that I came for her. The room fell silent as the men considered her words. Finally, Marco spoke up with obvious reluctance. She's got a point, boss, he said quietly. The kid's going to be traumatized by this whole experience. Seeing her sister might be the difference between cooperation and complete panic. Dante studied Celeste's face for a long moment, clearly weighing the tactical risks against the emotional necessity of her presence. Finally, he nodded with obvious reluctance. You stay in the car until we secure the building, he said firmly. No exceptions, no heroics. When we give the all clear, then, and only then do you come inside. Understood? Understood, Celeste agreed, relief flooding through her at being allowed to participate in her sister's rescue. The warehouse district was exactly as desolate as the photographs had suggested, all empty buildings and broken pavement that spoke of businesses long since moved to more prosperous locations. As they approached the address Trevor had specified, Celeste felt her stomach clench with anxiety and anticipation. Dante's team moved with professional efficiency, spreading out to surround the building while he and Marco approached the main entrance. Celeste watched from the back seat of the armored SUV as they disappeared into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for some sign that Sophia was safe. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional crackle of radio communication that she couldn't quite make out. Then, suddenly, there was the sound of shouting from inside the warehouse, followed by what might have been gunshots, though the distance made it hard to be certain. Celeste's hands clenched into fists as she forced herself to stay in the vehicle as promised, fighting every instinct that urged her to run toward the building and find out what was happening to the people she cared about. The waiting was agony, each second stretching like hours as she imagined every possible disaster that could be unfolding inside. Finally, her radio crackled to life with Marco's voice. "Building secured," he reported. "Threat neutralized. Bring her in." Celeste was out of the car before the transmission ended, running toward the warehouse in trance with her heart in her throat. She burst through the door to find Dante standing over Trevor's motionless form while Marco cut zip ties from Sophia's wrists. "Celeste," Sophia cried, launching herself into her sister's arms with desperate relief. "I was so scared. I thought he was going to kill me." "You're safe now?" Celeste whispered, holding her sister tightly and breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "You're safe, and we're going home." Over Sophia's head, she met Dante's eyes and saw the grim satisfaction there. Trevor lay unconscious but breathing, his face already swelling from what looked like a professionally administered beating. He was alive, but his ability to threaten anyone ever again had been permanently eliminated. "Is it over?" Celeste asked quietly. "It's over," Dante confirmed, his voice gentle despite the violence he'd just dispensed. "He'll never hurt you or anyone else ever again." As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Sophia clinging to Celeste's hand and casting nervous glances at the men who'd rescued her, Celeste realized something had fundamentally shifted inside her. The fear that had dominated her life for so long had been replaced by something stronger: love for the man who'd risked everything to save her sister, and determination to build a life worthy of the protection he'd offered. "Dante," she said quietly as they reached the SUV. He turned to her with questioning eyes, and she reached up to cup his face with her free hand, needing him to understand the depth of her gratitude and commitment. "I love you," she said simply, the words coming easily despite everything they'd just endured. "I love you, and I want to build a life with you, in your world, as your partner in whatever comes next." His smile was radiant with joy and relief, and when he kissed her it tasted like promises and new beginnings. The hours immediately following the warehouse confrontation passed in a blur of police reports, medical examinations, and careful explanations that painted Trevor as an unhinged stalker who'd been dealt with by private security acting in legitimate defense of kidnapping victims. Dante's connections ensured that the official story would be accepted without too many uncomfortable questions about methods or jurisdictions. Sophia had been remarkably resilient throughout the ordeal, her natural strength surfacing once the immediate danger had passed. She'd insisted on giving her statement to the authorities with clear determination, refusing to be treated as a fragile victim who needed protection from the truth. Watching her sister's courage in the face of trauma, Celeste felt a surge of pride mixed with gratitude that Trevor's actions hadn't broken something essential in the person she loved most. It was nearly dawn when they finally returned to Dante's penthouse, exhausted but unified by the night's events. Sophia had fallen asleep in the guest bedroom that had been hastily prepared for her, finally succumbing to the emotional and physical toll of her kidnapping. Celeste sat beside her sister's bed for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing and marveling at how different everything felt now that the threat was truly, permanently eliminated. When she finally emerged from the guest room, she found Dante standing at his kitchen windows, still wearing his clothes from the warehouse, but looking somehow lighter than she'd seen him since they'd met. The tension that had characterized his movements for weeks was gone, replaced by the relaxed confidence of someone who'd successfully protected what mattered most to him. "How is she?" he asked quietly as Celeste approached. "Stronger than I expected," Celeste replied, moving to stand beside him and leaning into the warmth of his presence. "She told me she wants to stay in the city and finish her senior year here, instead of transferring back to her old school. I think she feels safer knowing you're nearby." Dante's arm came around her waist with automatic tenderness, pulling her close against his side. "She'll always be under my protection," he said simply. "Both of you will. That's not going to change regardless of what decisions you make about our future." The certainty in his voice made Celeste's heart clench with love and gratitude. This man had turned his entire world upside down to keep her safe, had risked his own people to rescue her sister, and was now offering permanent protection with no conditions or expectations attached. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for during those dark months with Trevor. "I've made my decision about our future," she said quietly, turning in his arms to face him fully. "I want to be part of your world, Dante. Not just as someone you're protecting, but as your partner in building something lasting together." His smile was radiant with joy and relief, and when he kissed her it was with the passion of someone who'd been given an unexpected gift. They'd been through hell together over the past few weeks, had seen each other at their most vulnerable and most dangerous, and emerged stronger for the experience. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of introductions and adjustments as Celeste began the process of truly integrating into Dante's life and extended family. She met his uncle Giuseppe, the elderly patriarch who'd raised him after his parents' death, and found herself unexpectedly charmed by the man's old-world courtesy and genuine affection for his nephew. Giuseppe Salvatore was in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, but he treated Celeste with the kind of respectful warmth that suggested he approved of Dante's choice. "You make him happy," he told her during their first private conversation. "I haven't seen him smile so much since he was a boy, before the world taught him to be so serious all the time." The other family members were equally welcoming, drawing her into their close-knit circle with the protective instincts that seemed to characterize the Salvatore clan. She learned about their code of honor, their commitment to family loyalty, and their belief that strength came from unity rather than individual power. It was a far cry from the isolation and control that had characterized her relationship with Trevor. 3 months after the warehouse confrontation, Celeste found herself settled into a routine that felt natural and right. She'd taken a leave of absence from her gallery position to focus on her relationship and recovery, using the time to explore new interests and rediscover aspects of herself that had been suppressed during her months with Trevor. It was on a quiet evening in late spring, as they shared dinner on his penthouse balcony overlooking the harbor, that Dante surprised her with a question that changed everything. "Marry me," he said simply, producing a ring box from his jacket pocket with the casual confidence that characterized all his important decisions. The ring was stunning, a classic solitaire that caught the light from the candles on their table and threw rainbows across the white tablecloth. But it was the expression in Dante's dark eyes that took her breath away, the combination of love and certainty that told her this wasn't a spontaneous gesture, but a carefully considered commitment. "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice thick with happy tears. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." The proposal led to months of wedding planning that proved to be an exercise in blending two very different worlds. Celeste's family, traditional middle-class Catholics from upstate, had to be carefully introduced to the realities of Dante's profession and social circle. Her parents struggled initially with the implications of their daughter marrying into organized crime, but Dante's evident devotion to Celeste and his respectful treatment of their concerns gradually won them over. Sophia became an enthusiastic advocate for the match, having developed a case of hero worship for the man who'd saved her life. She threw herself into wedding planning with the energy of someone who'd been given a second chance at normalcy, insisting on elaborate floral arrangements and coordinating details with the precision of a professional event planner. The wedding itself was held at a restored mansion outside the city, a compromise venue that satisfied both families' desires for elegance and tradition. Celeste walked down the aisle in her grandmother's restored lace gown, feeling more beautiful and confident than she ever had in her life. The man waiting for her at the altar wore his love openly, his usually controlled expression soft with emotion as he watched her approach. Giuseppe performed the ceremony himself, having been ordained decades earlier for family occasions just such as this. His words about commitment and protection, about building something lasting in a dangerous world, resonated with an authenticity that brought tears to most of the assembled guests. When Dante slipped the ring onto her finger and promised to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, Celeste felt the last lingering shadows of her past finally lift completely. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd endured Trevor's abuse in silence. She was Celeste Salvatore, beloved wife of a powerful man who valued her as an equal partner in their shared future. The reception was a celebration that blended both their traditions, with her family's understated elegance mixing seamlessly with the Salvatore clan's appreciation for good food, excellent wine, and heartfelt toasts that went on long into the night. Even her initially nervous parents found themselves charmed by the genuine warmth and family loyalty that characterized Dante's people. 1 year later, Celeste stood in the renovated gallery space that Dante had helped her purchase in the Arts District, surveying the final preparations for her opening exhibition with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. The gallery was everything she dreamed of during those long months when Trevor's control had made pursuing her own interests impossible. Bright, welcoming spaces that showcased emerging artists alongside established names, a business built on her own vision and expertise. Dante had provided the financial backing and connections that made the venture possible, but he'd been careful to ensure that the creative and business decisions remained entirely hers. The gallery bore her name and reflected her aesthetic sensibilities, a testament to the independence and confidence she'd regained through their partnership. The opening reception was scheduled for that evening, and representatives from the city's art community were expected to attend along with potential collectors and art critics whose reviews could make or break a new venture. Celeste had spent weeks preparing for this night, but now that it was finally here, she felt surprisingly calm and confident about the outcome. Dante arrived as she was making final adjustments to the lighting in the main exhibition space, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame. He'd come directly from a business meeting, but his attention was entirely focused on her as he took in the transformed space and the artwork displayed to its best advantage. "It's perfect," he said quietly, moving to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist with familiar tenderness. "You've created something really special here." Celeste leaned back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence as she contemplated the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. A year ago, she'd been trapped in an abusive relationship with no hope of escape or independence. Now she was a successful business owner with a loving marriage and a future full of possibilities. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, turning in his arms to face him with a smile that held secrets. Dante's eyebrows rose with immediate attention, his dark eyes searching her face for clues about what might have brought such joy to her expression. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, watching as understanding and pure happiness transformed his features. His response was immediate and overwhelming, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around the gallery space while she laughed with pure joy. When he finally set her down, his hands came up to cup her face with the reverent gentleness she'd come to associate with his most tender moments. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly needing his reassurance despite the obvious delight on his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted: a home, a family, a future worth protecting." The gallery opening that evening was a tremendous success, with several pieces selling to serious collectors and art critics praising Celeste's curatorial eye and business acumen. But for Celeste, the real triumph was watching Dante work the room with quiet pride, introducing her to potential clients and making connections that would benefit her business while never overshadowing her own expertise and charm. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Celeste found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The contrast between her life now and her life 18 months ago was so dramatic it seemed like she was remembering someone else's experiences entirely. She was no longer the anxious, isolated woman who'd endured Trevor's threats and control in terrified silence. She was confident, successful, loved, and expecting a child with a man who treated her as an equal partner in building their shared future. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she had to remind herself it had all started with one terrible dinner at an Italian restaurant where everything had seemed hopeless. 6 months later, as she stood in the nursery they'd prepared in their penthouse, holding their newborn daughter and watching Dante's face soften with wonder as he looked at them both, Celeste reflected on the unpredictable ways that life could change in an instant. Their daughter had Dante's dark hair and her own gray-green eyes, a perfect blend of both their features that promised to be heartbreakingly beautiful when she grew up. But more important than her appearance was the sense of peace and security that surrounded her from her very first moments. This child would never know what it felt like to live in fear, would never question whether she was loved unconditionally and protected absolutely. "What should we call her?" Dante asked softly, his finger gently tracing their daughter's tiny cheek. "Isabella," Celeste said without hesitation. "Isabella Grace Salvatore." Dante's smile was radiant with approval and love. "Perfect," he said quietly. "Absolutely perfect, just like her mother." As evening fell over the city and their small family settled into the comfortable routine of new parents, Celeste found herself thinking about all the women who might be sitting in restaurants tonight, enduring the kind of treatment she'd once accepted as normal. She hoped they would find the courage to recognize that they deserved better, that real love looked nothing like possession or control. True protection, she'd learned, came from someone who valued your happiness above their own comfort, who encouraged your independence rather than demanding your submission, who stood beside you as an equal partner rather than trying to own you like property. It had taken her too long to understand the difference, but now that she did, she was determined to help other women recognize the signs of genuine care versus dangerous obsession. Have you ever found yourself wondering whether the love in your own life feels truly protective and empowering? Real love should make you feel stronger, more confident, more yourself than you've ever been, not smaller or more afraid. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with finding the kind of love that makes you feel safe enough to become the person you were always meant to be. The end.